It has really to see, I think, something of the very good and tense kind of empathy that was established. I have a very close friend, probably my closest friend is Madison, who is a psychotherapist, and this is not mine. I wouldn't subject anybody to that elaborate. And we have long talks, and he is persuaded that everybody is dead, and that really there's gray bony hands, it's just blood. And that there's no point in trying to do anything, and that ever since they put little mice on treadmills in psych labs, I have been carrying on the most fruitless experiment of anybody. It's an interesting byplay that we have, as my whole life is at stake. And it's been always my response that that probably is true. Half dead, yes, but the dead, no. And that what it takes sometimes is a sign of life, or a sign of authenticity, or a sign of some kind of reality. And I think that that brought some very great reality into a classroom. Some of you said to me after class, that it was a great thing, and that you hoped there was a lot more of that. And so many of you said that, but I got really a little paranoid when I got home. Because even though I am myself imprisoned by my own kind of language, which is historical language, I get up speaking that kind of language, and that nonetheless, I think it's real. And so I try to explain that to no great success, I must admit. But if there were more shell bases, they could certainly come to History 475 and have the platform whenever they wanted to. It's too bad that that sort of thing does not play a role in our lives. I'm doing a paper for a very limited audience that's going to convene in a phone booth somewhere. It's precisely on that, on the loss of revolutionary art in the course of the movement after the First World War. There's a lot of it. There was the November group in Germany, there was the Polish cult movement in the Soviet Union. There was a great deal of that kind of interaction of people going and troubadouring to the working classes of workers being organized or catalyzed to produce their own kind of rhythms and their own kind of art. And all of that gave a certain kind of shorthand truth to the reality that they were living. And it's really too bad that we don't have more of that. We have it really in the language, I think, that is very commonly spoken, and that becomes really a shorthand to a certain form of reality. Before I go on, is there any reaction that you have to that thing last time that you might want to offer collectively or anything of that kind? Or do you just want to sit on the experience as it was? Confront then the decade of the 1930s. The decade of the 1930s is, of course, one of staggering emotional proportions. They are years, if you please, that are the years of your fathers. They are the years, if you please, that are the years of that old left, which for a good number of reasons many of you condemn and many of you calumniate. They are years, if you please, of a kind of unrelieved tragedy. Let me point out to you that in the decade of the 1930s, there was incessantly unemployment in European and American countries, that there was incessantly bread lines, that there were concentration camps, and that there were slave labor camps. It was a decade, if you please, of such dehumanization that it is really almost impossible to find words for it. If you stop to think of what it is to be unemployed, and to be unemployed over a long period of time, and not to be able to support yourself or to find any stake in life, then you begin to understand what that dehumanization was. what that insecurity was. It's very, very difficult really to communicate that. I point out to you a source that is of compelling importance, those essays and those words put together by Studs Terkel now in a book called Hard Times, in which he took down on tape the memories of people who were so uprooted in the period of the 1930s, and conveys a little bit of what I mean by an age of unrelieved tragedy, an age of dehumanization. And also, if you please, an age of immense illusion. The illusion on the part of workers, for example, that the socialist parties and the trade unions that they had built and participated in could in some manner defend their positions. That trade unions and socialist parties, which had long since integrated inside the society, might be able to defend their waning and declining position in that period. And that turned out to be an illusion. Or the illusion on the part of those militants who really were revolutionary, that the communist movement and the communist parties of the 1930s were serious about making a revolution, only to discover that the Comintern and those communist parties talked revolution, but had no strategy for it or no intention of making that revolution. And then the direst illusion of all, the illusion that somehow the irrationalism of fascism, the irrationalism of the Nazi movement, that illusion of racial superiority, of imperialism, of conquest, that those irrational solutions would somehow resolve the problems of living that people by the millions confronted. An age of tragedy and an age of illusion, but one immensely complex, because these are years, I tell you too, of immense nobility and immense idealism, of a kind of sacrifice really that is almost incomparable. I talk to you about those people who fought to save a revolution in Spain. I talk to you about those people who fought to fight fascism to the death. I talk about those people who went to concentration camps and went into resistance movements because they would not capitulate to the loss of their humanity. All of that, if you please, a movement for, as Gabriel Paley once put it, the tomorrows that will sing, all of that part of the 1930s. An immensely complex, an immensely tragic, an immensely noble decade. The cadre for the 1930s, the objective reality, is the economic crisis. It is the depression of the 1930s that is the foundation for everything else that flows in that particular period. And if you ask the question, why the depression, and what the consequences of the depression, the answer really is not so difficult to find. On the short run, and technically, if you ask the question, why did the depression strike Europe in 1930 and last a decade, the answer has to do with the breakdown and collapse of the economy in the United States. That the United States, after all, had a commanding importance economically in the world. And that the American economy, which had seemed so very buoyant in the 1920s, began to decline by 1927, and in the stock market crash of October of 1929, really collapsed. Even before that stock market collapse, there had already been signs of great weakness in an economy that Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover assured us would provide eternal prosperity. There had been technological unemployment. There had been declining prices for farmers. There had been an unused productive capacity. All of that already was built in by the late 1920s, and the stock market crash sent that weakened economy plummeting really to the ground. And the effect of that upon Europe and Asiatic countries was profound. And the effect was profound because the United States had come to play in the 1920s such a very central role in the economies of European countries, in their recovery and in their economic stability. What were those effects of the crash of the American stock market? First of all, of course, insofar as there was a decline of American production that followed that collapse, there is a collapse of world trade. And it means that the foreign trade factor upon which industrial countries of Europe, especially of Central Europe, depended, that foreign trade factor began to collapse. You have, for example, these figures, that in 1929, the United States imported from Europe $3.5 billion worth of goods. By 1932, that was down to a little more than $1 billion worth of goods, and it means that the European countries lose that very important market. But there is a second repercussion that is almost immediate, and that is that American prices decline. Industrial prices decline less than farm prices because they are more protected. They are protected by monopoly and protected by tariff. So that you get between 1929 and 1932 a drop in industrial prices of about a third. And you get in farm prices a drop of a half or more. And those price drops in the American market meant that prices in European and other countries were bound to fall in order to remain competitive in markets. And that affected profoundly badly what we call the underdeveloped countries. Countries of South America and of Asia that were primarily monocultural, agricultural countries. They had to drop their agricultural prices in order to be able to compete with these price levels of the United States. But the primary impact of this American collapse came in terms of the disappearance of American capital from the European investment and loan market. And that is very central. Now you have to understand, you see, what American money meant in Europe in the 1920s. It's the period when the United States becomes a creditor rather than a debtor country. And it meant that American capital was used in two very important ways. It was used in terms of direct loans to governments in order to help them to meet their commitments. You had all of that recovery and reconstruction that was necessary after the war. You had the necessity of stabilizing inflationary currencies. And you had the necessity of finding money simply to carry on the functions of government. And consequently, loan capital was immensely important. But equally, if not more important, was investment capital in the private enterprise of European capital. And that's particularly true in Central Europe, in Germany, and in Austria, where American capital began to pour in. Now, what you have by the end of the 1920s is already a weakening of that export of capital because so much money in the United States is being invested in the stock market. And so you get, for example, a sharp drop in the amount of private investment in German industry. In 1928, $250 million invested in German industry. In 1929, only $40 billion, because so much money presumably could be made on the stock market. But you see what it means after the collapse of the American economy. It means, first of all, that the banks that have lent money, either to governments or to private enterprise, are now going to begin to call in those loans. They need liquid capital, and consequently they are going to call in the loans that have already been extended. And in the second place, there is no liquid capital left for placement in European markets, which has a twofold effect. It has the effect, first of all, of causing a severe and sharp deflationary practice by European governments. They simply do not have the money to carry on the kind of governmental functions they had before, and consequently they go into a deflationary policy, by which we mean they begin to cut services, they begin to cut their bureaucracy, they add to their own depression by that deflationary politics. And in the second place, it means that there will be a very sharp cutback in industrialization. If you take the German figures, which are very crucial and very important, you see the importance of that impact. If you take the year 1928 as the index year 100, by August of 1930, industrial production in Germany was down to 80. By August of 1932, it was down to 58. In other words, you almost cut industrial production in half in so important an industrial center as Germany as a result of this lack of investment capital pursuant to the American Depression. All of which means, of course, at the social level,
the primary factor about the economic crisis, which is unemployment. It is unemployment which was vast, widespread, and the most characteristic effect of this depression. On the overall, in the industrial countries of the world, there was unemployment upwards of 1/3 of the workforce by 1932. And if you take just the German figures, they really are staggering. In 1932, as Hitler, after all, is gathering his strength to come to power, there are officially estimated 5.75 million German workers unemployed. There are 5 million who are only partially employed, and it is estimated that there are some 2 million who are really unemployed but who escape the statistics. In other words, upwards of 12 million either unemployed or partially employed in a country of not much more than 60 million people. All of which shows you that you have a crisis of profound and primary importance. Now, none of that should be difficult to follow in terms of the spiraling effect of the American Depression. But there's something that I would point out to you that tells you more about the Depression, and that tells you something about the nature of capitalism, and something about the nature of the stage of capitalism that had been reached in the 1930s. If we said that the primary characteristic of this depression of the 1930s was unemployment, we are really making a commentary upon the structure of Western capitalism. What we are saying is that the burden of the depression was passed along to the backs of the working man. That the burden of the depression was passed along to those who did not have jobs because industrial production was cut back. Now, the reason that I make that point is that it is vastly different than the depression of the 1870s and 80s, which was the last very extended depression in world polity, in European affairs. In that depression, you have essentially a price-profit depression. In other words, what drops in the 1870s and 1880s are prices, and consequently profit margins drop, because that was still a period of relatively competitive capitalism. And consequently, when the productive capacity outstripped the capacity to buy, what producers did was to drop their prices in order to try to get more of the market, and in fact to produce more in order to try to reduce the unit cost. So that actually real wages for a period of time in that earlier depression actually increased. The burden was on the capitalists in that particular depression. And what it did was to generate a tremendous fear of overproduction on the part of the capitalists, a tremendous fear of an economy without regulation. So that between that depression and the time you had the economic crisis of the 1930s, you pass morphologically in the history of capitalism through a monopoly stage. You pass through a stage when capitalism begins to regulate itself, when it is so neo-mercantilistic, so afraid of a superfluity of goods, that it is going to have a built-in mechanism by which it can control that flow of goods. And the characteristic of this depression of the 1930s is that profits did not go down conspicuously, that fundamentally what you get is restricted production and prices remaining at reasonable levels so that profit margins can be maintained, and that is done, of course, by restricting that production and passing the burden along to the unemployed, who are the consequence of that restricted production. Now, the evidence for that is of course at hand. The Brookings Institute, for example, which made a study in 1935, pointed out that productive capacity in the United States, which already was only at 80% of full utilization in 1929, was reduced to 45% in 1932. The monopolies and the cartels are perfectly capable simply of restricting production. Or take that report of the German Institute of Economic Analysis, And you pointed out that products in monopoly trade, that those products in Germany that were really controlled by the cartel, that the prices of those products were reduced between 1929 and 1932 only by 10%. In other words, goods were still sold at 90% of the old scale. But in those trades which were still competitive, which were not cartelized, prices dropped to one-half of what they had been. And you see the point. The point is that you are dealing with a system perfectly cynical about the way in which it maintains its profit scale, the way in which it maintains its particular price structure, and passes the burden along to working men. And so it really raises the question of whether working men and women can and will cope in the 1930s with a system of that kind that dehumanizes and pulverizes them with, if you please, immense deliberation. And there are two limiting factors to whether they do respond and how they respond. And those limiting factors are tremendously important. One is the fact that there is a great difference in every industrial country of Europe in the 1930s, a great difference between the attitude of the employed workers and those who are the unemployed. Because, curiously enough, those who managed to retain their jobs in the 1930s did not suffer such a great loss of real wages. That money wages went down, but purchasing power or real wages for those who managed to hang on to their jobs actually did not go down so very much. And the explanations are twofold. One, the fact that there are trade unions that function defensively in the decade of the 30s, that enable those workers who have their jobs to hold on to part of their wage structure. But what is most crucial is the very sharp drop in cost of living. In other words, that the real sufferers were the producers of agricultural stuff, and that foodstuffs went down so drastically that the cost of living really meant that real wages for workers, those who could buy a job and hold on to it, were not so very bad. Now, all of that is important because it shows you why there is such a skewed attitude in the 30s, why the unemployed rally behind the most extreme formulations, why they rally behind the most extreme pushes up for revolutionary movements, and why the employed workers are very frequently timid and afraid to yield up their particular position. There is a division of the working class from that particular point of view, a division that is very well defined by Maurice Dobb in that brilliant book of his, Studies in the Development of Capitalism, a book in paperback which you might very well look at. And Maurice Dobb, speaking about England in that particular period, makes this comment. Without this division, we probably should not have witnessed the growing schism in the ranks of labor between the temper of those who felt on their persons the main brunt of the crisis and of that more fortunate 40% of the wage-earning class who were immune from unemployment throughout the Depression years. In fact, what we witnessed in England was the strange spectacle of this island remaining surprisingly aloof from the social and political currents that were convulsing large areas of the continent, and an attitude on the part of employed workers simply of maintaining what they had. So you get that division as one very important limiting factor. A second factor, of course, is the growing division between blue and white-collar workers. And that raises, conceptually, a real problem when you think about the potentiality for revolution in that decade. Now, Marx was quite correct in talking about the disappearance, the gradual disappearance of the old petty bourgeoisie. When we talk about the old petty bourgeoisie, we're talking about independent tradesmen, about craftsmen, about people that have an independency because they have a property or a conspicuous definable skill. And those people gradually disappeared before the impact of industrialization and concentration of capitalism. You get it, for example, in Germany, very conspicuously with the retail tradesmen. And that becomes an important factor in the rallying behind Hitler and fascism in Germany. Because retail tradesmen, throughout the 1920s, those lone small shops saw themselves constantly encroached upon by department stores. And by the branches those department stores began to establish and began to think, you see, about precisely what the Nazis ultimately began to talk about, began to think about a Gemeinschaft, about a statist society, an old-fashioned pre-industrial society in which the little man who was the small shopkeeper really had a place and would not be pushed out. And the Nazis played, of course, to that particular dream of a pre-industrial society and consequently picked up strength from that sector. But that sector, you see, is a declining sector. What is crucially important is what happens to the new petty bourgeoisie or the salariat. In other words, the salary earner, the white-collar worker. Now, these in every industrial society increase immensely as salesmen, as clerks, as technicians. Now, mind you, they have two things that blue-collar workers do not have. They have, in the first place, a skill, and they have, in the second place, generally a modicum of education, so that right from the very beginning, they differentiate themselves from the workers. But on the other hand, what happens through the 20s, and especially in the Depression, is to level the white-collar worker, to make him, after all, in the course of the Depression, as proletarianized, if not more so, as subject to unemployment, if not more so, as the blue-collar worker. Consider, after all, the report of Theodor Geiger, a very good sociological observer in 1932 in Germany, who said we have 25 million proletarians in Germany, but we have 45 million who live at proletarian standards. In other words, that these petty bourgeois really were reduced to that proletarian status, and so the real question arises, how will they go? Will they go with a revolutionary movement of the worker, or will they go against that? Who will capture that particular white-collar class? Now, there are ambiguous answers to it. If you read Dobbs, whom I have just mentioned, Dobbs' position was that the objective reality of the white-collar worker's status meant that he was organizable by the communists, organizable by the revolutionary force. This is how Dobbs puts it, when we bear in mind that 3/4 of all salary earners before the war earned less than 250 pounds a year, and hence were on the same income level as manual workers, that between the war, these strata were afflicted by unemployment only a little less than skilled manual workers, and like the manual workers increasingly became organized in trade unions, there seems little ground for questioning the overwhelmingly proletarian character of present-day society in Great Britain and of the present-day petty bourgeoisie. On the other hand, if you look at Germany, the reality was different. That white-collar class, after all, really filed behind National Socialism. That it became the mass cadre, ultimately, for the National Socialist movement. And in a way, you begin to understand that if you look at the position of the white-collar worker as of 1928 or 9, as defined in that brilliant novel that captured the German imagination, that really summed up so very much, that novel of Hans Fallada, Little Man, What Now? And Fallada wrote a novel, after all, right on the eve of the Hitler takeover, right on the eve of the Nazi success in 1932, in which he described what had happened to a whole stratum of German society, the little man, the white-collar worker. And what Fallada pointed out was that no matter how proletarianized that white-collar worker suffered from something nobody else did, he became dépassé. In other words, he could no longer assume to being part of the bourgeoisie, no longer assume to being part of the middle class, and on the other hand, he resisted, as though to the death, being part of the working class. He had some education, he had some skill, he would not call himself worker. And if you look at the biographies of early Nazis, of people in the early hierarchy back in the 20s, you find so many of this character. Joseph Goebbels, for example, who was really an extremely unsuccessful journalist with the Berliner Tageblatt, and who really had this resentment of having some education and having no career or future. Or Gregor Strasser, who ended up with a good education as being a petty little pharmacist. And these were people who refused to take the route of the proletariat and insisted upon that kind of wall or that kind of barrier. So you see, you have a problem. The problem is whether the left-wing movement, whether the communists will be able to rally what is an extremely important sector of the working force. All of which gives you a cadre and raises the question of what the response of working men and women was to that depression. Did they become radicalized or did they remain timid? Did their organizations push for structural reform or did they fail? Was the bourgeoisie rich in alternatives to its traditional liberal democracy? These are the crucial questions. And if you take the 1930s in block, you can really periodize that decade. And you can say that there is a response that is fairly universal between 1929 and 33, and then it becomes different from 1933 down to about 1938. From 29 to 33, there is a tremendous and almost inexplicable passivity on the part of the workers and the working class movement. That the social movement seems dormant and dead in that period. So that the offensive passes to the bourgeoisie and their particular government because it is a period when most governments are carrying on a deflationary policy. In other words, they are trying to meet the depression precisely by a technique that will intensify the depression, firing functionaries, cutting back on social services, expanding indirect taxes, which fall most heavily upon the poor. And then a shift from 1933 on. And the shift in two ways. That fascism triumphs in Germany and brings forth a tremendous challenge in the form of a pseudo-revolution. A pseudo-revolution, the nature of which I shall try to define to you ultimately in detail. But secondly, another response. A response to that threat of fascism in the period of the 30s, which is a front, a popular front between progressive bourgeois parties and socialist and communist parties, a front in order to ward off fascism and ultimately to try to make certain deep structural social reforms in the society. And so you get two periods, and we pose the question, why the stagnation between 29 and 33? And why let National Socialism triumph? And if you ask that question, I think that the answer has to do, to a great extent, with the immense failure of the two sectors of the working class movement, the socialist sector and the communist sector, both of which strike me in retrospect to be to blame, both of which give us records that it is important for us to ponder. For the socialists and the trade unions, in which a majority of organized working men and women belong in the period before 1933, in which you find most commitment, not in the Communist Party, but most commitment still in the old social democratic parties and in the old trade unions. Those socialist parties and trade unions have gone through a long period of integration. They belong to the state. As the Social Democratic Party of Germany put it, it was a national party, and not a class party, which means it had to represent progress, but not just stand for the working class. And consequently, when the Depression comes, there is a reluctance on the part of either the socialists or the trade unions to move outside the cadre of legalism, to move outside toward direct action, toward rallying the mass. Now, one could do this in detail, but just let me suggest several things to you. That by 1929, the free trade unions, the non-communist trade unions, were weak and timid. That the trade unions by 1929 really represented a minority of the workers, that in France only 10% of the workers were organized. In Britain in 1929, only half of the workers who had been organized in 1920 were in unions. In Germany, likewise, the numbers were halved over that particular decade. They came up to the Depression weakened. And in the Depression, they were afraid to launch strikes. They were afraid to do anything but defend positions and not expand positions. What really you can say about the trade union is that there is an immense poverty of thought. When they come up with the explanation of the Depression or what to do about it, they have no thinking that really belongs to the working class. They talk about restricting foreign labor from their country, a kind of human luddism. They talk about tariffs, the same way that capitalists talk about tariffs. They talk about public works, the way in which fascists talk about public works. And the most they came up with was what was called planism, which meant a definitive plan for economic production by the state, but not a socialist state or a workers' state, a corporatist state, a planism that really smacked of fascism when you really put it down on paper. And when you talk about the socialist parties, timidity is the key word. That they work so much within the framework of legality that even when they confront the decline and the disintegration of democracy, they do not strike back. That they support the Brüning cabinet in Germany in 1930 when it operates against democracy. That they support von Papen when he operates against democracy. That you have a socialist movement that has lost the knack of going to the streets, all of which puts the question squarely on the communists. And the question we ask is what happened to the communists? And they were in the Third International. And all of the communist parties, of course, were inscribed in the Third International. And by the time you come to 1929, you must remember two things. First of all, that the parties in the Third International have had many changes of leadership and many changes of strategy, and that those changes fundamentally represented or reflected changes inside Russian society and not objective changes in their own society. That the strategy and the line of the communist parties really became, in the primary instance, a reflection of internal Russian struggles. And that secondly, the goal of those communist parties, once you pronounce socialism in one country, the goal of those communist parties presumably dedicated to revolution, that goal becomes primarily a protection of that sector of the earth which presumably has gone to communism, namely the Soviet Union. By the time you come to 1928, the Sixth Congress of the Communist International meets. It meets in July of 1928. And that Sixth World Congress announces a new strategy, and a strategy that will be, in my judgment, a perfect disaster confronting either the Depression or the threat of fascism. That strategy is called the strategy of class against class. And it is a strategy that presumably announces what was called the third stage in the development of post-war capitalism. Because according to the strategists of the Comintern, a strategy had to reflect a stage of capitalist development. So you had the first stage between 1917 and 23, ending with the collapse of the German Revolution. And that was the stage of the revolutionary offensive, when capitalism was presumed to be in trouble, about to collapse, and the function of the communist parties was to launch revolution. Then came a second stage from 1923 to 28. And it is the stage when you go through capitalist stabilization, and when you have met the new economic policy in Russia. And consequently, when the strategy is the strategy of the united front. In other words, to try to make relationships with the socialist movements in order to build a big working class movement, primarily to defend the interests of the Soviet Union within Western countries. And now you announce a third stage of development. And you say that European capitalism is about to enter a period of crisis, and consequently it's not a united front, which is the strategy, but now class against class, you go back to a very radical kind of strategy. Now this is enunciated in July of 1928. And there is no cadre in Europe at that particular time which justifies it. The American economy is still prosperous. The German economy is still experiencing its Indian summer. And consequently, it reflects something else. What this class against class shift reflects is, of course, Stalin's shift to the left inside the Soviet Union, and his dismissal of Bukharin and the right inside the Soviet Union, and the need to replace all of the Bukharin leadership within the Communist parties of Europe. In other words, it is a shift that really has to do with Russian affairs. Now, there was an assumption made, and the assumption was not so inaccurate when you come down to 1929, but it is an assumption that goes like this in 1928. That European capitalism is on the verge of a crisis because its productive plant will outstrip its market. And this will lead to imperialistic competition and war. And it will lead to a desire on the part of the capitalist countries to make war on the Soviet Union in order to prime its economy. And finally, it will mean depression and a sharpening of the class struggle. All of which meant, according to the Comintern, the need for another strategy. And it went like this, that if there is a sharpening of the class struggle, if there is crisis about to arise, then what the communist parties have to do is break off all relations with the trade unions and the socialist parties. Those relations they had tried to effect in the mid-1920s, and to disenchant, to demystify the working classes about those particular agencies. To point out that social democracy and free trade unionism were handmaidens of capitalism, that they worked within the framework of class collaboration, that they were, to use the terminology of the time, social fascists, that they were like the fascists because as the fascists wanted class collaboration, so did the Social Democrats and so did the trade unions. But in fact, they are worse than the fascists because they pretend to stand for the workers, they pretend to represent their interests, and consequently, they must be condemned, they must be exposed. At the very dawn of the Hitler threat, at the very dawn of the Nazi threat in Germany, the line of the Comintern is that the worst enemy, the number one enemy, is social democracy, and that no possible collaboration with it can be countenanced under any circumstances. The consequences of that should not be difficult to determine. You get in the first place on the part of the communist parties something that you had already had with the social democratic parties of the Second International before the First World War. What you get with the communist parties is a tremendously radical rhetoric without any real preparation for a revolution. You begin to get that immense chasm or gap between verbiage on the one hand and reality on the other. That these communist parties weren't going to make a revolution, weren't preparing for them, the Soviet Union didn't want one in those areas, and consequently their revolutionary verbiage was itself a kind of mystification. And you get, in the second place, a breach between the communist parties and the mainstream of the working class. The mainstream of the working class remained within the social democratic and trade union agencies. And what the communists began to corral in very large numbers, in Germany, for example, were the unemployed, the Lumpen proletariat. Now, with the Lumpen proletariat, you can do what the German communists did. You can make tremendous street action. You can go out and make all kinds of noise in the streets, but you cannot cripple industry. You cannot, in a sense, strike at the very center or the very heart of the industrial enterprise. And consequently, it becomes again verbiage. But the primary consequence of this kind of tactic was to divide the working class movement in a disastrous way. To say to the petty bourgeoisie, to say to the white-collar worker, that these movements of the working class were too weak to defend their interests, and to so divide this working class movement that it didn't even really put up a fight when Hitler came to power. Ultimately, the test, you see, is with the KKK. The test is with the German Communist Party. And I'll tell you that it is really a tragic story, because the KKK had courageous and brave people in it, and did corral the will of a great number of militant, unemployed workers. But the KKK, from 1929 down to 1932, pressed the point, not only that the Social Democratic Party was enemy number one, but that you could even make, yes, you could even make a temporary alliance with the Nazis in order to strike at the Social Democrats. That was done in Prussia in April of 1931. It was defended by Ernst Heilmann of the KKK on this ground that the few trees of Nazism conceal the forest of social democracy, that they are the Social Democrats who have defogged the workers and not fundamentally the Nazis. And it was Stalin himself who said to Hans Neumann, for example, of the KKK in 1931, if Hitler comes to power, won't he be primarily concerned with the West and leave us free to develop socialism in Russia? And you see a kind of self-interest that is profound and deep at work. Not that the socialists were any better. That the socialists, after all, after Hitler came to power, that the socialists went and made a joint May Day in 1933, even as their organizations were being destroyed. No. It is sterility and bankruptcy on both sides, and the Nazis, of course, move into that way. And it is to that problem and to the response to it that we really must address.